Joining me now is Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator and the best-selling author of The War on the West. Douglas, let's start with an issue that's close to your heart and to mine. Author Salman Rushdie was attacked on stage in New York. He was there to deliver a speech on artistic freedom. And this man has now lived with a bounty on his head for 3 decades, thanks to Iran's Islamist mullahs.
That's right. It's since 1989, Salman Rushdie's lived with this threat hanging over him. I mean, we should stress from the beginning that, I mean, the attack is both absolutely unbelievable and all too predictable. It's not just that the Ayatollah Khomeini ordered this fatwa on Salman Rushdie in 1989, but that for decades since, people, including in Australia and Britain and America and other countries, have called for his murder, called for violence to be done against him. Prominent figures have excused that. Prominent figures in the media, even at the time, called for violence against Salman Rushdie. All we have to remember for the alleged crime of writing a novel. And so this attack is, of course, something that is absolutely shocking and terrible. And thank goodness some of the news today is of his recovery. But this assassination attempt, it clearly was, repeated stabs to his throat and so on, is an attack on freedom itself. It's an attack on freedom of speech. It's an attack of the closed mind on the opened one, of the didacts and the fanatics of Tehran and other Islamist movements, thinking that they can control what all of the rest of us in the world, Muslim and non-Muslim, are allowed to hear, read, speak, think, and say. And so I hope that this time, unlike in 1989, the condemnation is total, complete, no caveats, no ifs, no buts, none of the on the one hand, on the other that we've had with the case of Salman Rushdie all of these decades. Just solidarity with an author who's been just appallingly assaulted.
And we've seen attacks also against people associated with him, his publishers, his translators. We've already had murders because of these fatwas. And what the Ayatollah Khomeini really did all those years ago was pit extremist Islam against Western values of free speech and expression. But Douglas, it seems some 30 years later, the West is actually failing to uphold those values.
Well, I think that's true. I think that there's an oddity about the Satanic Verses affair always, which is that the book has remained in print. You can buy it, and I urge people to do so. It's remained in print, but in the decades since, actually, we've had less and less freedom of speech, particularly on the issue of Islam and Islamic extremism and the origins of Islam, actually, as it happens. Part of the Satanic Verses includes a very funny reimagining of how the Quran might have come into being. It's the sort of thing which, if you said it about Christianity or Judaism or any other religion, wouldn't detain anyone for a second, let alone cause a scandal or 30 years of death threats. But this is, you know, one of the accusations against the Satanic Verses was that it was blasphemous. But, you know, in the decades since, we in the West have to a great extent effectively imbibed that argument. We've sort of agreed that you can blaspheme as much as you want against anyone, say whatever you want, but not with Islam. No different rules apply. And so effectively, the Rushdie case has become a sort of foundational case. We've agreed in our societies that we will not publish cartoons of only one historical figure, Mohammed. We've agreed that we can't publish novels basically lampooning him or criticizing him, or publish books like that, or say things that are critical. And this is, of course, intolerable. It's the demand of one fanatical sect of Islam to dictate not only what all Muslims are meant to be able to say, but what everybody else is too. And that should be deemed totally intolerable by anyone with any sense of pride, anyone with any sense of the importance of freedom or freedom of speech. And as I say, I just very much hope that people realize that this is an opponent and an enemy that cannot be remotely consoled or consolidated or sort of bargained with. This is an opponent that wants to shut down what we're able to do and say, and is even willing to call and suborn the murder of novelists. And I hope people realize what we're up against in this, because I very much fear that we don't, and that we've given up much of our freedom effectively voluntarily.
Now to the war against women, and more historical female figures are being erased by the artistic community. Joan of Arc is going to be portrayed as gender neutral in a new play at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. And guess what? Queen Elizabeth I may have also been non-binary, apparently. I mean, if you don't fit these strict gender norms, Douglas, then you're trans or non-binary. It's actually a very backward way of looking at things.
Isn't it? Isn't it? I mean, it's extraordinary. It's as if you'd taken a sort of 1950s sexist view and then inverted it, turned it around, accepted it. I mean, Joan of Arc, because she was strong,
and medicalised it.
Yes, but Joan of Arc, because she was a strong woman, must have not been a woman. Elizabeth I, because she was a strong woman. Well, how could she be a woman and strong? She must have been non-binary. I mean, it's preposterous, isn't it, Rita? I mean, it's like we're going back decades, erasing feminism, erasing women in history, great women in history, disappearing them. And by the way, as you and I have mentioned before, isn't it odd? It only happens this way round. We don't have people saying that male figures from the past were actually probably women or non-binary, but this sort of it's always women who get it, isn't it? It's always the females of the past that are erased.
Oh, I just thank God that I grew up at a time where being a tomboy was acceptable and no one was trying to medicalise my aversion to dolls and the colour pink. Now, I want to show you some footage from earlier today of hundreds of immigrants crossing illegally into Eagle Pass, Texas. That Del Rio sector has had around 400,000. Just think about that number, 400,000 illegal immigrants crossed since October, Douglas. That's just incredible numbers. That's more than the population of Cleveland since October. You've written about how the Democrats have moved from worrying about illegal immigration to encouraging it.
Yes, I mean, the most extraordinary things about this is that if you go back to the 1996 election, for instance, Bill Clinton's platform, Democrat platform, the election, was all about, the fact that the Democratic Party must be a party of law, and that included having legal migration and not allowing illegal migration. Fast forward to 2022, millions of illegal migrants enter the US each year, and the Democrats don't seem particularly bothered by it. And something very interesting has just started to happen, which I wrote about in the New York Post this week, which is that so far, it's states like Texas that have borne the brunt of this. And so the governor of Texas has recently started busing illegal migrants to other cities, including so-called sanctuary cities, where left-wing politicians in New York and Washington talk about, sort of love is love, no human is illegal, and so on. And New York has had 4,000 migrants sent from Texas in recent months and is buckling. The city's provisions for this are buckling under the strain. And I just think it's extraordinary. First of all, the governor of Texas is quite right to be able to say, let's share this around a bit, guys. And if you're going to encourage this, you can deal with some of the consequences. But I think the more interesting thing is that the left wing's policies on migration are always like this. They have open borders because they don't believe that there should be borders. But then, at some point, somebody has to deal with the consequences of that. For instance, of having millions of people who are effectively living in the black economy, or who are going to put a strain on housing provisions that are already strained. So it's a really interesting example, this is happening in New York and Washington, that part of the left is getting dose of the reality that it has been wishing on everyone else.
Absolutely, and particularly when you look at New York and the Democrat leaders there whining about this, they're a sanctuary city. They proudly proclaim that they're a sanctuary city, and when Governor Abbott sends them the illegal immigrants they're inviting in, they say they can't cope with 4,000 when there's 2 million plus crossing illegally at that southern border. Incredible stuff. Douglas Murray, thank you so much.
Great pleasure.